Hello and welcome to another episode of the Iran War Podcast. Sorry, just kidding. Global tantrum. I am your host, Steve Halley. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. And with us increasingly is our special guest, Professor Andrew Lieber, as well. He is back for return tour of duty to discuss week 3 of the Iran War. Last time he was here, he was very clear about saying that week 3 would be, I guess, unknown territory for many of the participants in this war, this ever evolving and ever worsening conflict in the Persian Gulf. And so here we are, it's week 3, and things are getting a lot worse. We're going to dig into it in detail, in all the gory detail, because there's so many things to talk about, guys. This has gotten bigger and gotten worse along every conceivable dimension is basically how I'm thinking about it. And we're going to get into all of it. But, you know, the way we've been talking about this conflict on this show is to talk about the 3 overriding strategic questions of the war. Number 1, who is in control of Iran? Is it the mullahs or is it some new government? Number 2, are the Persian Gulf allies of the United States still getting hit by Iran? And number 3, is the Strait of Hormuz closed? And as of right now, time of recording, Thursday, March 19th, we are still 0 for 3 on those questions. And we can take those in order, or we can go straight to Andrew for a check-in on the Gulf monarchies. I think we should do that, honestly, because
Agreed.
man, yeah, there's been some
Sure.
news, and it's been bad news, right?
Yeah. Yesterday was kind of like a categorical shift in that, like, I've been getting texts, obviously, from friends in the region from elsewhere. It's kind of how things are going. Yesterday was like, I guess I'll try to censor this a little bit, but like, was the first, like, getting texts was just like, what the heck is going on in the White House? Like, what is the decision making after
Yeah.
the United States signed off on, was fine with an Israeli strike on Iranian natural gas fields, which then led to an Iranian ballistic missile strike on Ras Laffan, which is Qatar's main liquid natural gas production plant, apparently taking out like 20% of Qatar's total potential to produce liquid natural gas for like 3 to 5 years, causing somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to $30 billion of damage, and raising alarm bells about what could be done in the entire region, in addition to other strikes in and around the area. So I think you're not necessarily like a sustained escalation, but like, I think somebody in Tehran has probably read With Arms and Influence by Thomas Schelling. It's just sort of like, okay, you're going to hit our gas fields. We're sure we can hit your gas fields. Your move.
Tit for tat, right? And
Yeah.
not only that, my understanding is that the Israeli strike on the South Pars field, which is a massive field, also hit some of, Qatar's assets, or affected them in some way, or were close enough to like scare the hell out of them. I'm not exactly sure which,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like an adjacent asset. Their North gas field is my understanding. And
Yeah, it's a shared gas field. And then if you go to the far north of Qatar, you can like see lights off the coast of Iran. Like, it's not that far away.
yeah,
But yeah.
and one thing we know about natural gas is it's very flammable. So if you blow up a field next door, may not necessarily stop there, right? But yeah, that was one of the many large developments in the Gulf over the past week. My understanding is the UAE has been taking it the worst, and they're up to, I think they're over 2,000 projectiles and counting
Correct.
that have been sent from Iran to the UAE. Now, most of those are Shahed drones, but also plenty of ballistic missiles. And the UAE has been mostly successful in intercepting these things, but not entirely successful, right, Andrew? And from what I can
Yeah.
tell, this is starting to have a compounding effect on their
Yeah, I would say
operations.
I'd say if there's kind of 3 dynamics that are worth keeping in mind from, by the 3rd week that are all interrelated. But one is Iran demonstrating an ability not just to kind of hit energy installations, not only, I know this is another one of the strategic questions, but not only to block the Strait of Hormuz, but also to steadily shut down any alternative route for exporting energy. So the United Arab Emirates invested in a pipeline that would allow it to export some oil through the coastline of Fujairah, one of the 7 emirates that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has demonstrated it can hit that. Iran has hit ports in Oman that are an alternative. Saudi Arabia is currently exporting a significant amount of oil through an east-west pipeline that does what the name says. It moves oil from the production area in the east to the ports in the west. But
Yeah,
yesterday,
Yanbu, right? It's called
yeah,
Yanbu on the
and
Red
Iran
Sea,
also demonstrated they can hit Yanbu with the drones and missiles. So
of course.
that's not great. So one is demonstrated capacity from Iran that they can continue to escalate against the Gulf's core economic assets. Second thing we've seen is that the drone campaign has continued. You've seen a lot of people, I think, basically making the same fallacy that various U.S. officials did in the Vietnam War by focusing on like, well, we're making so much progress because we're destroying so many Iranian missile launchers, rather than focusing on like, can Iran still send missiles and drones? Like missiles and drones on the UAE and elsewhere down from the opening salvo, but have held steady for a while and have been increasing in recent days. And the UAE, I think, implying or claiming strategic reasons, just stop publishing how many they're shooting down, and Iran has also been shifting more of that fire to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia kind of spared in the first couple of weeks. That's ramping up. And then maybe the third dynamic we can talk about is that there's been kind of this open question of like, what does the Gulf do now? I think they're in the same position that when we talked 2 weeks ago, but you're seeing Gulf states try to feel out like, well, different positions, ranging from, on the one hand, you have Oman, whose foreign minister published an article in The Economist saying that this is a war kicked off by Israel and the United States has lost control of its foreign policy, to the United Arab Emirates, which has had its officials do television interviews saying like, we're really mean at this time, we're potentially going to strike. Anwar Gargash, an Emirati official, saying that the UAE would be happy to join a like protection coalition to shepherd ships through the Strait of Hormuz, but a lot of trying to figure out exactly what to do now.
Yeah. Can I ask two related questions to this, Andrew? The first, the Wall Street Journal reported that a lot of the Gulf monarchies are now saying they want the United States and Israel, now that the war is on, to quote unquote finish the job, that it would be the worst of all outcomes for this war to have happened and the Iranian regime to remain in place. So first question is, do you think that that is essentially correct? And secondly, I saw a report today that the Saudis are now contemplating returning fire now that they're getting targeted more directly, and how you rate the prospects of sort of direct Saudi military intervention in the war.
Yeah, on the first one, I think that was like the Wall Street Journal article from Yaroslav Trofimov.
Correct.
Yeah, I've heard conflicting things about that story. One thing I've been tracking, and I have a piece maybe coming out talking about this, it's really tricky that like people, like media outlets talk about Gulf states wanting things, because then there's 6, and it's a little bit like whack-a-mole, like which of the 6 is it?
Right.
In this case, I mean, I don't know, my colleague James Acton, somewhere else at Carnegie, focuses more on like nuclear non-proliferation. I think had a good tweet post about this where he was like, like that. Well, like if I take up golf, the only acceptable outcome is that I win the Masters or something like that. It's kind of like sure, you can demand that the United States finish the job, but like, I don't know if the United States has that capability. And I think one challenge we're seeing is that I do believe that for a lot of these countries, and to be specific, I think in declining order of my confidence, like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and then Qatar, there was a belief that there must be some kind of U.S. strategy. They're like, okay, like you guys had to have thought this through a little bit, right? And the belief that like, okay, now is the time to really go for it. That secret strategy we've been waiting for that's going to like rapidly move this war to conclusion. And then like, I don't think it exists. I think in terms of military intervention, I still lean towards thinking that the UAE is more likely to do so than Saudi Arabia first, because the UAE has more of a narrative that like, well, we have a competent military. We're literally said like we're doubling down on our relationships with the United States, even with Israel. We won't take this. Saudi Arabia, I guess it's more likely, but I also just think there's been statement after statement sort of reserving the right to respond, but like after the 4th or 5th time, it's not clear like what would trigger a response. I still think that like if there's a concerted attack on desalination plants, then that maybe makes this existential and there's a response. But the fact that like 20% of Qatari liquid natural gas production has been taken offline for half a decade, and the response was once again, we reserve the right to respond at a time of our choosing, I think that that's not forthcoming. I hope that I'm right, because I think everything gets worse if that
Yeah.
they get involved. But Yeah, anyway, I'm skeptical, and I'm also skeptical that Iran would target desalination plants on its own, because the only time we've seen that happen was, again, tit for tat. Israel struck, or the United States, I can't remember which, struck a desalination plant in Iran. They struck one in Bahrain. Everybody agreed to like kind of stop doing that.
Yeah, I have a question for you, which is, yeah, like last time you mentioned that week 3 would kind of be terra incognita for these countries when it comes to ability to roll with the punches. So all of these countries are now firmly in emergency territory. It's like, is that a fair characterization in terms of
Yeah.
like, yeah, what's happening now? And their business models are being wrecked. Their futures and presents are being degraded, even though not so many people are being killed necessarily. A lot of infrastructure is
Mhm.
getting destroyed. And most importantly, it's like their reputations as modernizing states, safe havens, financial centers, entertainment centers, cultural centers, all of these things. Like it's hard to do any of that when missiles and Shahed drones are flying around. And it's just like it seems to me like full reverse in the last 10 to 15 years of progress in these places is just getting undone and degraded. And like so like on top of everything else, it sounds callous, but it's like it's a PR disaster and a marketing disaster. And like it sounds dumb to like say it that way, but I think it's true. And I am wondering if any of these states are thinking the unthinkable involving like reaching out to Iran surreptitiously and being like, hey, like, can we cut some kind of deal with you guys and so you just stop doing this? Or do they not think that that would work even?
I mean, it's really hard to tell. Like, I think these are some of the moments when, like, I step back a little bit from, like, on the one hand, I'm kind of a proponent of being like, you actually can learn something from minute shifts in the elite rhetoric of Gulf officials. But then, kind of in moments like this, I think you also have to take a bigger step back to think, like, what does the broader context tell us? And that going back, 35 years at this point tells us that the Gulf and Iran go back and forth between time periods in which there's greater conflict and time periods in which there is less conflict. And every time there's conflict, officials on both sides will tell you, like, this is the point of no return. The degree of distrust between both sides will never be regained. We will not
Yeah.
go back on our word here. And then later, it's just kind of fine. Like, maybe there's always a chance this time is different. But I also remember, like, during the Qatar crisis, when there was a severing of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one hand, Qatar on the other. Again, this is like a watershed moment. Things can never go back to normal. And then they're just kind of, they're kind of fine now, not forgotten, but forgiven, I guess. So I think that there's certainly, like, if there were a deal on the table, well, like, I think that they would gladly take it. Like, I think one
Yeah.
reason the Houthis haven't gotten involved is that there's a deal under the table where Saudi Arabia is happy to pay them a certain amount of money to not fire rockets and just like kind of keep
Well,
things in stasis there. I'm sure that they're reaching out, but like, I don't think anyone is interested in dealing with them on the other hand. I mean, they've all kept,
Right.
with the exception, I think, of the UAE, they've all kept Iranian ambassadors in place. Even when Qatar got hit at the liquid natural gas plant, they just told like the defense attache of the Iranian embassy to please leave. But like only you,
Right.
man, this is a long time ago, but I used to work in Qatar for a now defunct branch of the Brookings Institution. And we would like see, like, you would meet Iranian diplomats like at events. They'd be like, oh, hey guys, how's it going? But I imagine those are a little more tense right now. But anyway, sorry to get off track there. But yeah, I think that they really don't have kind of many options, though, is the thing. Like, they're still stuck in the same position, except they kind of had some time to not take a decision because you had air defenses. You could kind of buy time. There was enough time to have people like publish articles about how, like, don't worry, Dubai's not dead yet. And it just seemed a little like, premature to say Dubai is dead, but I also think a little premature to write articles about how it's still going great when like drones haven't stopped falling.
Yeah.
And there's still no way out. Like, there's no reason to believe that any of these states has like a credible military threat that is somehow qualitatively more threatening than the United States of America and Israel, both of which have nuclear weapons. And in the other direction, like, they seem unwilling to use forms of leverage they do have against the United States, like namely the ability to move money around. And
Okay.
just talking about benefits in the future doesn't seem to be getting through.
So that's really interesting. I'd like to double click on that because like yeah, the Emirates and the Saudis have maintained tremendous investments in the U.S. I used to work in the video games business, and the Saudis have been buying up video game assets like crazy, mostly through like sovereign wealth funds and private equity partnerships and things like that. And there's lots of examples of those types of investments in the US economy. Do you think that they're looking at those like coercive levers to see if they can apply any leverage to the US, or is that still unthinkable?
I think there are some people who are thinking about it, but I really think that just there's, like with the exception of Oman, nobody's like really thinking openly in those terms. There's too much of a concern of like what Trump might do in backlash. There's like an aversion to kind of taking risks in that direction. There's been like nothing before has kind of prompted that. When we did see Saudi Arabia like push for some kind of action with respect to Gaza, but it was done very carefully, like working with France so France could take some of the heat, advancing through the United Nations, like trying to not get in Trump's way too much. So, well, I think as like it's technically possible to have an impact there, I'm skeptical that they'll kind of pull that lever anytime soon. Maybe if it goes on like another 3 weeks, but at this point, I'm not sure.
Okay. They haven't taken enough pain yet, but like the door is open, I would say, to starting to have these conversations.
But instead, they just kind of have doubled down on the anti-Iranian rhetoric. Like Al Jazeera now has a bunch of people on to talk about like the perfidy of Iran and whatnot. I certainly get it. Like if I were being bombarded by Iranian drones, I would probably not be in like a sanguine mood about the situation. But all of the rhetoric from every country except Oman has been to kind of highlight Iranian actions, criticize them more, not go to the point of taking any military action. But then it's like, okay, like at what point, well, I guess maybe there isn't one, but like it's the rhetoric doesn't seem to have an effect, and there's not much you can do coercion wise. And the air defense stuff can only last but so long.
Exactly. Yeah, they're kind of stuck and their stocks are being depleted. And so assuming that the Iranians can keep up the rate of fire, which is a big assumption, like we can anticipate things will get worse over time. And then maybe like some of these other tactics can come into play. I also wanted to get back to something you said about the Houthis and Yanbu and oil going from the Persian Gulf over to the Red Sea via that pipeline in Saudi Arabia. The Houthis pretty effectively shut down traffic to the Red Sea a few years ago, using similar tactics to what we're seeing in the Persian Gulf now. And that has not happened yet. And that means that Saudi has been able to get some of its oil to the world market. So things are not as bad as they actually could be. But that is definitely something to keep an eye on if the Houthis join the conflict and start shooting at shipping in the Red Sea. Like this could get even worse, which is
and also that campaign depleted a large number of interceptors for a pretty much non-state actor group. So leaving aside I agree, potentially very significant global economic consequences if the Houthis start firing, that will further spread thin these interceptor stocks, which by most accounts appear to be dwindling to potentially dangerous rates.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so that's the Gulf states. I think we can segue pretty naturally into the Strait of Hormuz and perhaps the Red Sea as well, right? What's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, Galen?
Look, last week, I said I was kind of leaning toward your analysis that this was not going well for the United States and Israel. After a week passing, with the key caveat, which you and I have been discussing quite a bit, that we have very little information on what the Iranian side of the ledger looks like. And there's a lot of fog of war to deal with, and no one really knows how depleted their missile stocks are, how depleted their missile launchers are, so on and so forth. I would say I have moved closer to where you were last week in the intervening period. And one of the reasons why has to do with this question of the Strait of Hormuz. You sent me an article in Foreign Affairs by Caitlin Talmadge that painted a pretty bleak picture of what would have to be done in order to clear that waterway, and people can go read it. I won't go into the nitty-gritty detail. Suffice it to say now, if Caitlin Talmadge said it about military affairs, I tend to believe it's correct. And, one of the things she said in there was one of the only ways to pry this thing back open would be put ground troops on Iran's coast to defend the area and prevent Iran from getting shots off. I find it quite telling that Trump basically started asking other countries, including China, which I was somewhat amused by, but especially NATO countries, for help in clearing the strait. And they have quite emphatically said that's not going to happen. To me, that's a key detail. Another key detail is we just learned the Pentagon submitted a request for $200 billion in supplemental funding. That is, just to put that in context, that's roughly a quarter of the entire U.S. defense budget on an annual basis. What does that tell me? That suggests to me that the Pentagon now believes this is going to be a protracted war. And one of the reasons for that is I don't think they have a good solution to what to do on the Strait of Hormuz. And just in case anyone is confused about this, I think the reporting here has been quite good. It seems quite clear that Trump was made abundantly aware that this was a risk prior to taking military action. And the reporting I saw, basically, he said was, we don't have to worry about that. By the time that becomes an issue, Iran will have capitulated. Which means we don't really have a plan in place. And, before we get to the issue of, I'll let you talk about the third key question, which is potentially the most significant one of, where the Iranian regime is currently. It seems pretty clear to me that the United States and Israel don't have a viable political strategy at this point. By all accounts, the military campaign has been executed excellently, gone off quite well. In the same way that Israel has scored a major streak of military successes since October 7th, 2023, but lacked a viable political strategy for converting those military successes into long-term political gains, I think the same logic very much applies in force right now. And I'm very worried that this is turning into a war of attrition, which is precisely what the Iranians want. And I'm sure we will talk about the Lebanese dimension of this conflict later. But I think a war of attrition is very, very dangerous for Israel. And that's a key reason why Israel has historically not fought wars of attrition. So on the Strait of Hormuz, I really think the Iranians have the United States in a bad way. And some of the retaliatory options that are being considered now, we mentioned the bombing of South Par's gas field. Trump has said he didn't know about it and didn't like it. The reporting I saw is that's categorically untrue, and the Israelis have said as much today. The United States could either blow up the oil installations or try to seize them on Harg Island, which is a key oil facility where Iran, I think, exports something like 90% of its petroleum products. The problem with all of these options is it takes more petroleum off of world markets. And that is a double-edged sword, because while that would certainly hurt the Iranians, it would also hurt the United States, because that would send oil and gas prices higher, and per what Andrew was just saying, probably invite further attacks from Iran on goal critical infrastructure. So this seems to me like a real problem. And Trump did say today he's not planning on putting troops anywhere. And I think you and I sort of agree that potentially means that this Marine unit that's heading to the region might be gearing up to seize Harg Island.
Yes.
But that's going to be a risky operation. It could be casualty intensive. And at a minimum, I don't think the United States has a plan to reopen the strait in the short or even intermediate term. And I think that is a big problem.
It's a big problem for the entire world. Yeah, I want to make it clear that it's a big problem for the United States and its allies in the region, but it's actually an even bigger problem in some ways for the entire world. It's like super important that we talk about this, because not only is the Persian Gulf, one of the biggest sources of fuel exports, it's also one of the biggest sources of fertilizer precursor exports, like urea and ammonium and chemicals like that. And we are getting towards planting season, at least in the northern hemisphere, where much of the world's grain is planted. The prices for fertilizer are going to go up. That means there's going to be a smaller harvest later in the year, pretty much no matter what happens. Even if the war ended tomorrow and, prices were miraculously going to go back to normal tomorrow. Some of the damage is getting done right now when it comes to food prices, 6 months down the line, because that cake is getting baked. And food prices rise in the developed world. It's bad. People don't like it. And they vote the incumbent out of office. Food prices rise in the developing world. You get food riots and in some cases revolutions and things like that. The Arab Spring was at least partly precipitated by a spike in food prices in that region. And by the way, Andrew, you probably know more about this than I do. It's like the Gulf states themselves are very vulnerable to food price inputs because they have to import most of their stuff. It's pretty hard to grow stuff there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, like they've like bought up tons of farmland in the Horn of Africa and
Right.
East Africa more generally to try to like have the luck. But historically, the challenge with that has been if there's a situation where you really need that food, then like if globally everybody needs that food, that also means the people who live on the land you technically own need that food. And when you come to try to tell them that actually, sorry, this needs to be exported and sent to another country that technically owns this land, it doesn't always go over well.
Not very well. Yeah. And just getting back to fuel shortages, like setting aside food for a second, it's like we're not seeing fuel shortages in the United States yet. We are certainly seeing it in East Asia, where there's now rationing in, I think, Thailand and not so much in China yet because they built up the reserves. The Japanese, the Taiwanese, and so on. The Koreans, they're all getting hit really hard. A third aspect of shutting down the Persian Gulf, and I didn't know about this until I read about it recently, is it's a major source of helium. Why is helium significant? It's a major input when it comes to creating semiconductor chips. And we had an episode before the Iran war kicked off about the importance, the geopolitical importance of semiconductors and how they feature into basically every aspect of modern economies, right? So if semiconductors rise in price because this key input is cut off and we can't replace it fast enough, we probably can't because like this refinement capacity doesn't come online overnight. It takes years to build up. This is another sort of brittle chain in our supply chain, and that could have economic consequences. So all of this to say, it's a disaster what's happening in the Persian Gulf, geostrategically for the U.S. and increasingly for the Gulf states and Israel, it's looking like. But it could be a calamity that has really global implications. And if this conflict lasts too much longer, some of that stuff is going to come into play in a really nasty way. And Galen, it's like we got the key signal, I think earlier today, you already alluded to it. The Trump administration has asked for $200 billion in extra funding. Our understanding is that the war so far has cost about $11 billion. So if we assume a continued conflict at current intensity, that would extend the timeline out for more than a year. If we assume a higher intensity conflict than what we're currently seeing, then it's not clear what that looks like. Does that look like ground operations? Are we suddenly willing to take lots of casualties? Or is there something else we're not seeing here? In any case, it's a key signal that we're really in for it when it comes to this conflict. So I wish I had better news or better analysis, but it's looking really ugly in the Persian Gulf as far as the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, that brings us to the third question.
Yeah.
Which I think is the one from which the others flow, which is how brittle is the Iranian government at this point?
Yep.
And just to cover a few background details, and then I think, can debate it.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone has a very good idea. I mentioned last week, and I think we saw, frankly, more information on this come out this week. U.S. intelligence services assessed prior to the war that it was unlikely that the government would fall. I am now seeing some reporting that Israeli sources are sort of basically echoing that analysis now that the war has started, although that's kind of hedged by maybe this war will create the conditions over the medium term if the shooting stops for Iranians to overthrow the government. I don't view that as a likelihood, but I guess it can't be completely ruled out. Here's what's happened in the intervening time since we last recorded. The Israelis are really doubling down on this, hunt and kill operation to really go after and assassinate high ranking Iranian officials. They killed the head of the Basij, which is sort of the volunteer plainclothes militia that's loyal to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But the big news was they killed Ali Larijani.
Yep.
Who is someone we had mentioned previously, I think the last time Andrew was with us, as a pragmatist. Certainly a ruthless guy, was sort of at the heart of power in Iran for a long time, was close to the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. So not trying to paint him as any sort of, great individual, but was viewed, at least by some U.S. negotiators, for example, leading to the nuclear agreement, as the adult in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And someone you could at least do business with potentially. Whether he was going to be that same sort of individual now that the war is on, I can't say, but the fact that he was someone who thought in pragmatic terms is significant. I couldn't tell you what's going to happen in Iran. As I read the situation, the Israelis are trying to sow chaos by taking out high-level Iranian leaders. They are trying to make it difficult for security forces on the ground to impose their will on the rest of the Iranian population. I think that strategy has real limits.
Yeah.
There are people like Kenneth Pollock, and if I'm going to invoke Kenneth Pollock, I have to say this was someone who advocated the 2003 Iraq War, the beginning of the anniversary of which I believe is tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
So, I'm not necessarily inclined to take his advice on regime change in the Middle East, but calling for things like close air support in favor of Iranian protesters. I think the likelihood of collateral damage in that scenario is probably quite high. It seems from all the evidence I've seen, which again is spotty, that the security forces in Iran still control the situation.
Yeah.
And it is still far too dangerous for Iranians to rise up. So we're back to the question of putting boots on the ground. And as we've talked about, and we've heard more reporting about this over the last week, it does seem like the new guys in charge, now that the last supreme leader and many of his allies are dead, is potentially going to be more hardline.
Yeah, much tougher, right?
Yes. So this is all to say, I don't have a great feeling about where things are going to go. And one of the key questions is just how much damage has been done to Iran's forces, which I have to think is substantial, whatever the numbers are. But without a new government on the ground, I think this turns into a lengthy war, which is probably exactly what Tehran wants. And the last thing I'll say on this is Israel has done a massive expansion of the war in Lebanon.
Okay.
And I'm not totally sure what their objectives are, whether it is to, again, as Israel has done in the past, create a sort of buffer zone in southern Lebanon, which, when Israel invaded in 1982, they did not finally withdraw from that area until 2000. They have had repeated rounds of conflict with Hezbollah. It seems like the goal is to completely root out Hezbollah, in the same way that nearly 3 years of punishment of Hamas in Gaza did not destroy Hamas or affect a real political transformation. I'm not sure that's something that can be achieved in Lebanon either.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the situation is pretty bad, at least in the long term. And maybe we'll get more information indicating that the regime is more brittle, or that military assets have been so degraded that Iran is really weakened for the foreseeable future. But I personally would not bet on that. And it raises the question of what any sort of political outcome to this looks like. And I don't have a good answer for that.
It doesn't seem like it's within range right now. Israeli doctrine, at least recently, has been to try to kill its way out of these situations. Right. And you can call it peeling the onion. You can call it whack-a-mole. I think we've called it both, actually, on this show. Mowing the grass is another somewhat odious way of putting this. It's like we hunt and kill these leaders. But as I remember reading, like now decades ago during my master's program at U Chicago, It's like you roll the dice every time you do this. And it is very much not the case that you're going to get somebody better 100% of the time when you remove somebody up top. And like, I think we're seeing this in action, right? It's like, if anything, it generates more chaos. And it actually makes me think of our episode on the Mexican cartels, right?
Yeah.
It's like you introduce chaos to the situation. The people that rise to the top are those who are best equipped to win in chaotic situations. They're typically the most violent people. And we may be seeing that play out in Iran right now, although it's almost impossible to tell what's going on in Iran,
Yeah.
perhaps in Lebanon and in Gaza as well. And the United States is now along for the ride when it comes to this Israeli doctrine.
Can I just like, as an example to lay this out, I think people are more familiar with the case of Iraq 2003 and
Sure.
everything that did to facilitate the expansion of Iranian influence across the rest of the Middle East. But since we're on Lebanon, it might be just useful to sort of talk about how this has gone in the past and what that illustrates about the broader problem of converting military success into political gains. So Israel started having a problem with Lebanon really after the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was expelled from Jordan in 1970. So right there, by the way, it was already a problem on one of their borders. It was transported to their northern border. And the PLO sort of became a state within a state. The Israelis really tried to do damage to it in 1978. It was a relatively short military operation. Then they did a full-fledged invasion in 1982, which we now know had much grander military objectives than just weeding out the PLO. The idea was kind of to transform Lebanese politics and get a peace treaty and, finalize Israel's borders there. The outcome of that was the PLO was evicted from Lebanon and its leadership kind of exiled to Tunis for about 10 years. But in its place, they got Hezbollah,
Right.
which was trained, equipped, helped come into being by revolutionary Iran in the early 1980s. And Hezbollah, one of their first big military successes was the terrorist attacks on the US and French embassies and then on the US Marine barracks, which successfully got the United States out of Lebanon. As I said, Israeli forces were not fully withdrawn from Lebanon until 2000, which was seen as a real victory for Hezbollah. There was another major war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 that was sort of fought to a draw. Israel kind of tried to decapitate the organization in 2024 when they killed Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah and did the famous beeper attack that, took out a huge number of Hezbollah leaders. And now they are engaged in another major ground operation in Lebanon. And fundamentally, what the problem is that the Lebanese central government is not strong enough to deal with the reality of Hezbollah on the ground, and that you still don't have an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement, which would facilitate Israel working with other players in the region on this problem.
Including the Gulf states, right, Andrew?
So you can have all of these military successes. And, as I said, the first of these major operations against the PLO, leaving aside when it was in Jordan, was in 1978. Here we are almost half a century later, and Israel is still using military means to address the problem. Now, if you think about what that looks like, I forget what Lebanon's population is, but Lebanon is, I think, smaller than New Jersey.
Yeah.
Iran is a country of more than 90 million people and is the size of California, Texas, and Florida combined. So the Middle East is kind of littered with these stories. And at a certain point, without a political success, it becomes really difficult to see how these military operations end up going well.
Yeah, no, here's another one of those stories, right? And like Andrew, you've talked about how the Gulf monarchies don't want to get involved in large part because they cannot be seen operating in a military sense with Israel. And it's like the more of this type of stuff that Israel does, the worse the problem gets, right? in terms of their ability to actually operate in a useful way and defend themselves, which they're not currently doing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this was sort of the whole thing about the Gaza war. Like now it's presented as like, Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia just woke up one day and decided that actually he didn't want to do normalization anymore, whereas he was full well and happy to sign off and continuing to move towards normalization in September of 2023.
Right.
But then you had month after month of devastation of Palestinian civilian populations, setting aside the political complexities of that situation. Then eventually it just becomes politically untenable for any Saudi leader to sign off on a deal with Israel in that circumstance. And now, even if Saudi Arabia is clamping down on this kind of discussion, the Omani leadership is happy to go to like The Economist. It's not like they're like writing in some obscure tiny publication nobody's ever heard of. You got the Omani foreign minister writing The Economist being like, America is effectively doing Israel's bidding in this war, or is following Israel's lead in this war. Like, his words, not necessarily mine. And like, if the Omani, you can't like fully ignore the Omani foreign minister, even if you can kind of like complain about him online.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it speaks to the extent to which there's just a viewpoint of like might makes right. And like it aligns very well with Trump's view of like, well, we're a powerful global country. We don't need to abide by any rules or regulations, but political gravity eventually reasserts itself. And then it's like, I guess, this is kind of a glib comparison, but it's just astounding to me that you're like, okay, you had multi-year Gaza war, after multiple previous Gaza wars. And it's like, okay, who is the main political entity in control of the territory of Gaza now? And it's like, okay, with some exceptions for what territory you're talking about, it's like, okay, Hamas still exists as a political entity there. The United States tried to use a massive air war against the Houthis in Yemen to force them to stop attacking shipping. And the end result from that was like, I guess this doesn't work. We're just going to stop. And you're trying to do that with a country now that is like, just bigger. Like it's a basic point for people, but trying to explain that like 2,500 Marines is like a lot if you're trying to, I don't know, like deal with like an Eagles football fan riot in Philadelphia or something. 2,500 Marines is not a lot if you're dealing with like a 600,000 person army fighting on their own soil and in their own cities.
Yeah, it's a difference of scale and a difference of degree. And I want to go back to the Omani foreign minister. The Omani foreign minister is sounding a lot like certain aspects of the Republican Party. All of a sudden, within the MAGA movement here in the United States, it's like we're talking about political solutions. What about political trouble for the Trump administration? We got some high-profile resignations in the past week, including what's the dude's name? Like Joe Kent.
Joe Kent, he was the head of the National Counterterrorism Center.
Yeah, a guy that I had not heard of, but somebody who appears to be a serious person with an important job.
I do want to say, like, he was a January 6th conspiracy theorist and believes a number of other things that I certainly don't. But
I did not know that. Thank you for saying that. Okay.
But he's a high-profile guy, to be sure, and I think it is creating political problems for the administration.
It certainly is. All right. So maybe less serious than I made him out to be, but somebody important in the administration resigned his post earlier in the week. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but saying much the same thing the Omani foreign minister did. This administration is conducting Israeli foreign policy on behalf of Israel, not on behalf of the United States. It's, again, a paraphrase, but it's go ahead.
There's something from even the resignation letter that was like strange even to me. Like I think some people misread it initially because they're like, oh, he was saying the war in Iraq was instigated by Israel. And I was like, no, his wife, I guess, died in like operations against ISIS in like 2019. Wow. And he's saying like that was like at the instigation of Israel, which is like a very specific thing to be claiming, which like I haven't looked at the specifics of that, but that seems like more conspiratorial than like was involved in the Iraq
war. So there's definitely fine lines and gray areas here, and where this particular gentleman stands, I'm not sure. Right? I do think it is notable that he was basically like, this is not America first foreign policy, right? Like at a minimum, it's not America first foreign policy, and I don't agree with it, and I can't work for this administration anymore. And we know that there are other people in the administration that were not in favor of this operation. Tulsi Gabbard, JD Vance. There are others who are pretty silent at the moment. And I just wonder what's going to happen to Trump's political base as the gas prices continue to rise, because they will inexorably. And I want to just go back and say really fast, even if the war were to end tomorrow, shipping would not necessarily begin tomorrow. The shortage would not ease tomorrow. It would be a process of months because of the way insurance works and risk mitigation and all the other pieces of this incredibly complex commercial puzzle. I read a piece about so-called actuarial leverage, right? And how, like, more than anything, like, yes, Iran has been doing military damage and lighting ships on fire. The insurers all pulled out. And this is a group of like 7 companies headquartered in London. And to get them to come back is not simple. And it is not actually within the sovereign power of the United States to get them to do that, right? It's like, no, to restart this will be a matter of months once some sort of political accommodation is reached. And we're very far away from a political accommodation being in sight. We're still talking about killing our way out of it, right? So yeah, I got off topic here and I forgot more or less where I was going, but it's like, yeah, like energy prices are going to rise. We've got the midterms coming up, and like, I don't know what Trump's going to do about this.
Well, since you mentioned Vance, because I think this is a nice segue into the questions you're posing. The New York Times reported that what he said in the deliberations leading up to this, he was actually not opposed to it, but he said, like, if you're going to do it, go hard and fast or something.
He did do
like
that. He did say that.
And well, so here's what we're somewhat speculating. And I think, as Andrew said a couple weeks ago, if FOIA is still around in 25 years, maybe we'll find out then.
Nice.
But it seems to me that the basic story here is that the high-ups in the administration thought that this was going to be quick and really did not have many contingency plans in place for if it wasn't quick, which I would argue, as would many of their own intelligence officials, should have been entirely foreseeable that it was not going to be quick and easy. And that says to me that they don't really know how they're going to deal with this. And that's how I interpreted Trump's stuff about invoking help from NATO and things like that was, oh no,
I think you're right.
This is a real problem and I had not anticipated it. And what do we do now? I think if I were going to predict things, and that is a perilous business in general, but particularly when it comes to something as complex as this, my 2 cents, and granted, some of the political forces you're talking about within Trump's base, I find utterly loathsome. And we talked a few weeks ago about the potential for an anti-Semitic backlash in the US. And I'm very much hoping that that does not come to pass, but I remain worried about it. I think we could, by the way, have a discussion about, Andrew and I have been working on a thing, talking about how much Netanyahu was working on encouraging Trump to get involved. That's a pretty different argument that many of these people are making. And I certainly hope it's more an analytical case than the sorts of things those people believe. But I think that opposition, if it has an economic impact, and based on what we know, I don't see how it won't, those political forces are going to become a problem for Trump. And I think he is going to respond to those political incentives at some point. And if the Iranians are not in a position where they have been substantially weakened over where they are today, I think that's going to require the U.S. to make some concessions.
Yeah.
And I don't know what those concessions are, but I've been turning over some of these things in my mind, like some of Iran's demands, right? U.S. military bases out of the Middle East. I find it hard to believe the United States would do that. Credible pledges that it will never target Iran again or allow Israel to target Iran again. I don't know how realistic that is. And I don't know how one could actually prove to the Iranians that those guarantees were credible given recent events.
Let me stop you right there. These are beyond maximalist demands that you make when you do not want to make a deal. Right. That's how I interpreted it. It's like, oh yeah, we're just going to throw this stuff out because screw you guys. we're going to keep fighting. And to your point, like I at some point in the future, there will be a deal to be made, and there will be diplomacy conducted. I have to believe that. I don't know when. Like it's not going to be tomorrow or next week, obviously. Maybe not even next month. But both sides will have an interest in stopping the fighting. I think Trump will come to the table first, and he will not have leverage. So the Iranians are going to get at least some of what they want. But can we stop the Israelis from doing whatever it is they're going to do? And how is Trump going to react to being put on the back foot in a way that is humiliating, right? He's not a guy who responds well to that type of stimulus historically.
Well, I have three concerns here. Well, I have more than three, but three that come to mind. One, he decides to take these political forces as an off-ramp and basically blames the Israelis. And I don't think you have to have much of an imagination to think about what scope gating the Israelis does potentially in the United States.
Yeah.
That's a concern. Two is further escalation.
Yep.
And whether that's seizing Harg Island or blowing up the facilities on Harg Island, or I don't know what some of the other scenarios are, putting ground troops on the Iranian coast to try to pry open the Strait of Hormuz. We've talked in the past about what it would look like to seize that 60% enriched uranium that we think is buried under Isfahan. The scenarios I've seen for that are it's an extremely delicate process because you're working with radioactive material that's buried underground in an active war zone.
It would take weeks.
And that's in the center or much farther off the coast, right? Now you're in a position where the Iranians have all of the terrain and the upper hand on it. So escalation or a negotiation that leaves us far worse off than we were prior to the conflict. And I can't resist here making the point. This is what those of us that supported the JCPOA were saying. Like, this was kind of the choice. You could have an imperfect deal or a potentially much worse war
that we'd lose.
And that negotiation, it's hard for me to see, knowing everything I know, that it potentially someday down the road doesn't lead to a nuclear Iran.
Yes.
And I was always, well, I guess like sort of post grad school or post being at the University of Chicago, which you mentioned earlier, once I had sort of gotten smarter, believed that a nuclear Iran would be a problem for the Middle East. And the fact that they've been able to cause this much havoc to the international economy and to the region without nuclear weapons suggests to me that if they did have nuclear weapons, the problem would be substantially larger. And short of this war shifting course, and I just don't know if Trump has the time, I don't see how it's not some scenario like that that's pretty ugly. But
but you need a counterparty to do that, right? You need a counterparty to do that.
And I want to add one more time, like, we just don't know what things look like inside Iran very well.
We don't, but like the signs are not good. Ali Larijani was a nasty dude, but he was a guy demonstrably you could negotiate with. He negotiated the nuclear deals, plural, over the course of many decades with various Western powers. He was known in the West for being a negotiator. He's dead. And by all accounts, he was in charge of the day-to-day business and running the Security Council and so on. Who does that leave in charge? We don't know. Maybe it's Mojtaba. So one thing I've been reading about, and it kind of depends how much credence you put in this, the religious proscription by the elder Khamenei, against the seeking of nuclear weapons, the fatwa, right? That died, apparently, with him in Shia Islamic jurisprudence. So Mojtaba, who is apparently not much of a cleric, he's kind of like mid-range, but they kind of like jumped him up so he could, wear the big hat, so to speak, of supreme leader. He can renew it or he can do something else. That's going to be up to him. And by all accounts, he's a more extreme guy than either Larijani or his dad. We don't know a whole lot about him, but like what we've learned is not super encouraging, especially now that we've killed his entire family and perhaps critically injured him. If for all we know, he's dead and somebody else is in charge. He hasn't, shown his face. So who's the counterparty that Trump's going to negotiate with? If it's Mojtaba, as opposed to somebody like Larijani might have been pragmatic and like offered some kind of off-ramp or a fig leaf to Trump, understanding that like, okay, we won this war. I'm going to pocket Iran's winnings and go home. Like, we've accomplished a lot here, as it turns out, and like, we need to rebuild. Mujtaba doesn't have the same level of experience, maybe a nastier guy in general. Maybe he is going to want to prosecute the war in such a way that it becomes clear to the entire world that the United States has lost. And he will not stop until he secures that. That's what worries me, is the counterparty isn't there.
Can I make one other point on this, which is there's always this debate, whether it was with the JCPOA or even before that, post 9/11, like the hardliners and the moderates within the Iranian government.
Yeah.
And there was always this debate, like, how do you strengthen the moderates? Can you even do that given Iran's system of government? My position, which I think we talked about last summer, is Iran is capable of thinking and acting in power political terms, as you put it, within a set of constraints. And the name of the game is operating within those and potentially steadily expanding them out if you can. The New York Times had a really great reporting on the succession process after the supreme leader and his allies were killed. Khamenei did not want his son to be the supreme leader.
Right.
Because it would set a bad precedent of monarchical rule, which in theory the Islamic Revolution of 1979 was overthrowing.
It is an Islamic republic. It is a
correct.
theocracy, but they have Republican trappings, I guess.
Well, so what emerged from me reading that, and then Akbar Ganji, who writes for Foreign Affairs, had a similar piece there, was like Israel and the United States kind of helped resolve Iran's succession problem.
By killing everybody else around him?
Yeah, and potentially empowering the more hardline factions. And it's like, there was this effort after the Assembly of Experts, which we've mentioned before is the group that elects the new supreme leader. There was an effort by the moderates, like the president, Masoud Pezeshkian, and people like Larijani, to try to undo this vote.
Oh, wow.
And basically they were outmaneuvered. And this accounts in part for why Pezeshkian apologized to Iran's Gulf neighbors, and it was quickly kind of walked back or spun as not intended. And that was the hardliners pushing back and saying, no, no, no. Now that we're in a war, we have the upper hand. So again, a lot we don't know, but that says to me that the hardliners currently have the clear upper hand. And that means, to your point on having a counterparty, it might be some time before that surfaces.
What are their objectives, right? Making sure that this doesn't happen again, and making sure that Iran somehow eventually comes out stronger, which, they're taking a lot of punishment. So, Andrew, any last thoughts or words on this topic?
Just on the succession stuff, because I've studied this a bit for authoritarian regimes. Like, one thing it reminds me of, there's like an article a while back on succession in Syria between Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, where one of the arguments that was like, because Bashar al-Assad was relatively weak, there were a lot of powerful power brokers who were all suspicious of each other, but they could kind of agree on like, well, we'll just put this like relatively weak guy in charge, because then we all know that he's not going to try to become more powerful than us. And it feels like a bit like that in this situation. You have a lot of different potentially powerful actors who, had this been other circumstances, succession could have been a very politically dangerous moment as all those fights come out into the open. But because you have all this political pressure, it's like, okay, we got to hurry up and pick somebody and move on so everybody knows their public is stable in this time. So to Galen's point, it's has kind of eased a lot of constraint, or you've made it easier to get through that succession point and then just kind of move onwards, regardless of how able around Mujtaba is.
Right. And perhaps somebody who is somewhat underestimated as well. That story that you're describing reminds me a little bit of 1990s Russia and Vladimir Putin, who is supposed to be kind of like a pliable puppet type figure for the oligarchs. Guess what? Turned out very differently. You just never know when you roll the dice like this. Well, I think we're at time for today. Before I go, I want to ask you, Andrew, if there's any articles or appearances you'd like to promote before we go.
None. I mean, I have a piece coming out, I think, with a blog for Carnegie in a couple of days. I'll send it along if it comes out.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure our watchers and listeners would love to read that. And thank you again for joining us. As always, like your insights, like super invaluable. And like, we'll have you back because I think this is going to be a going concern for some time. Unfortunately for the region, and in fact, the world, And again, like to our watchers and listeners, I wish we had better news to report this week, but we just don't. And, that's why this show's called Global Tantrum. So thanks for joining us, and see you all next week.